as I continue my series today on women ministries in the New Testament. I have done videos on about 10 different ladies, and I know there's several others, but there's not enough documented evidence to do a whole video on them. So I decided to go into this subject about debunking the idea that women were silent in the early church. The notion has been debated for centuries, and many believe it to be based on certain Bible verses. But when we take a closer look at the historical context and the scriptures themselves, we discover a much richer and more active participation by women in the life of the early church. Let's look into these documented facts and explore the truth behind this conception. One of the primary verses that often comes up in discussion about women's role in the early church is 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 34 and 35, which reads, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church." Now, on the surface, this seems to suggest that women were to be silent and subordinate in church gatherings. However, it's crucial to remember that this was a specific instruction from Paul in a particular cultural, historical context, a time when the early church was dealing with a variety of disruptions and misunderstandings. But this verse does not stand alone in the New Testament. If we look at other scriptures, especially those in the same Pauline epistles and the book of Acts, we see a different story, one of active and powerful roles for women in the early church. I heard a minister preaching on this one time, and he said, in Paul's day, the church back then, women were on one side of the church and the men were on the other. And back then, those women, most of them couldn't read or anything. And so anyway, he was discussing something, and they were wanting to know what he meant, and they were hollering across the room at their husbands, what was he talking about? Yes, they were never to speak out and distract and disturb a man if he was speaking, because it was disrespectful. Now, that's what I have heard of teaching on now, but you can take that and, look into it and research it if you want to. But there were women leaders in church. I've done some 10 videos on some of them. Phoebe was one of those, and she was a deaconess and a leader in Romans chapter 16 and verse 1 through 2. Paul greets Phoebe, calling her a deacon or servant at the church of Cenchreae. Junia was an apostle and a missionary in Romans chapter 16 and verse 17. Now, Priscilla, a teacher of Apollos, Acts 18, 24 through 26. Acts 18, verse 24 through 26. The women who supported Jesus' ministry were several of them. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 1 through 3, he had Mary Magdalene and the wife of Susa, Herod Stewart, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. There were several women that were not only present but active in Jesus' ministry. And you can read that in the book of Luke, there, chapter 8, starting with that 8 if you want to go and check that out. Now, the Bible, when considered in its entirety, represents a more complex and empowering picture of women in the early church than the often quoted verses that suggest they were to be silent. Women like Phoebe, Junia, Priscilla, and the women who supported Jesus were an integral to the spread of the gospel, to teaching, leadership, and ministry. While Paul's letters contain instructions about order and behavior within the church, these were often specific to particular cultural contexts and issues the early church was facing. It's vital to understand these teachings within the broader framework of the scripture, where women are shown to be strong, capable leaders and active participants in spreading the message of Christ. So let's continue to embrace the truth. Women were not silent in the early church. They were leaders, teachers, servants who played vital roles in the growth of Christianity. Thank you for joining me today as we debunk the common misconception. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into this biblical topics. Today, the scripture that I have used, if you want a reference to it, it's Romans chapter 16, verse 1 through 2, Romans chapter 16, verse 7, Acts chapter 18, verse 24 through 26, Luke chapter 8 and verse 1 through 3, and 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 34 through 35. Until next time, hope you have a blessed week.